class on the laws of Tzitzis. Please God, today we will conclude all of the laws as they are discussed in the Kitzur Shulchan Aruch. We'll start with a little revision of what we've spoken about until now. So we spoke about the specialty of this mitzvah in the first class, and then about the two types of garments. There's the talis katan, the small garment, which is worn as part of one's clothes. And we spoke about the material and dimensions of that. This is our third class on the laws of Tzitzis. Excuse me. Please God, today we will conclude all of the laws as they are discussed. And then we have a talis gadol, which is worn for davening, and how that should be a beautiful garment. And one needs to buy them from a trusted source. We mentioned the concept of not mixing wool and linen. We discussed the hull, how it's strategically positioned, not too far in because it needs to be on the corner, but not too close to the edge because that's already not considered on the corner, but rather pretty much off the garments. Yesterday, we discussed the knots and the coils. So they should be equally spaced. And the system is a double knot and 7 coils, a double knot and 8 coils, double knot 11, double knot 13. I don't know if any of you got a chance to check your talis this morning to see if you did, Terry. It's very common for there to be a mistake, by the way, because in these coils, because it's all done by hand, by human, and they're not really checked over a second time. In fact, it's usually done by actually yeshiva students. There were a few guys when I was in yeshiva in Israel that every day they would eat quickly, and then the entire lunch break, they'd have their earphones, and like a machine, they'd just be spinning their hands the whole break. And then they made a lot of money like that. But there's room for human error, so it's worth checking that. We spoke about the length of the strings, the proportions, 1/3 tied, 2/3 untied, and the idea of keeping the sides separate. And when we spoke about keeping the sides separate, then we jumped to a later section which speaks about what happens if the strings ripped. That was section 13, so we visited that. And then we are up to now halacha vav, the 6th halacha, which speaks about the concept which we already touched upon, which is that a mitzvah should not come about in an indirect manner. It shouldn't come about in a roundabout way, but rather it should be done deliberately for the purpose of the mitzvah. And he gives a few examples of that. So he says, if the strings were not cut from each other, but rather one very long string was taken and folded to make 4 strings. So instead of first cutting your long rope into 4 pieces, you just kind of folded it over and you slipped it through. So now you really have one piece of string that's going in and out of the same hole. And then you started tying them. And then afterwards, you decided to cut the edges. I guess the reason you would do that maybe would be to, I'm not sure what the reason would be. But either way, he says that this doesn't work. Why? Because as we said, the verse says, you shall make tzitzis for yourself. We infer from this that you must make the tzitzis and not tzitzis that come into being by themselves. Meaning that it is required that the tzitzis be valid when they are attached to the garments. So if while you're tying them, you're not doing anything, because right now you're not, because you don't have 4 strings, you have one very long string. So when you tied them, you didn't have 4 strings. And then when you snap them, when you chop them at the end into 4, so now you haven't tied them. So it means that the mitzvah is coming about in an indirect way, because what you're tying is not tzitzis. And then suddenly you have tzitzis, which you never tied since you had the tzitzis. So the idea is that the mitzvah needs to be done deliberately for the purpose of the mitzvah and not in an indirect fashion. And this principle will come up again a little bit later in today's class. They may not be invalid at the time of attachment and become valid afterwards through another action, which would cause them to be valid. Like I mentioned yesterday, the example of, or the day before, somebody who puts creepers to grow on top of his sukkah, and then he just chops them before sukkahs. So that's not going to work, because the idea is to put the schach onto the sukkah, not to do something else that indirectly makes it kosher. And there are other examples of this in the Torah as well. Similarly, if the tzitzis were made properly on another garment, and that garment tore, and you wish to place the tzitzis in the same way on another garment, or even on this same garment, for example, if the garment tore from the hole until the edge of the garment, causing the tzitzis to fall. So you have that sometimes when people are trying to pull the tzitzis, they grab it by the string, And then what happens is it actually just comes off completely. So it ripped off. So then you don't want to have to re-tie all of these strings. So instead, you want to just sew up the hole so that you kind of just sew up the hole through the strings. So he says that doesn't work. Why? Because again, right now, the tzitzis are invalid because they're not tied onto anything. And they need to be tied. You can't do something else to cause them indirectly become tzitzis in an indirect way. Rather, it needs to be done in a direct fashion. Okay. So similarly, if you tie the tzitzis when the garment was exempt from tzitzis, for example, when most of the garments was sewed, meaning if it didn't have four corners because it was sewed all the way down the sides, so then you don't have your four corners yet, and you first put on the strings and then you cut it on both sides, again, it's invalid. Why? Because when you put the strings on, it wasn't a four-cornered garment. And when it became a four-cornered garment, you didn't put the strings on because the strings were already there. So we have reoccurring the same principle that mitzvah needs to be done directly and actively. It can't come about as a result of something else. Okay. So that was as far as number 6 is concerned. And then yesterday we moved on to the inspection. So we said before putting on the talus, you should check that they are valid, check that the strings are intact, they haven't ripped, not on the bottom, not on top, and you should separate the strings one from another by just sliding your fingers down so that you are ready to make the bracha. Okay, and we got up to making the bracha, and this is kind of where we left off. And we said that on principle, whenever we make a bracha, thanking Hashem for a particular mitzvah, so we always make the bracha before we do the mitzvah. There are a few exceptions. Yesterday we discussed one of them, but that's the general principle. So the same would be over here. This is actually the first mitzvah in the day that you're doing by first making the bracha and then doing the mitzvah. So therefore you should hold the talus with both hands and think consciously that the Holy One, blessed be He, Hashem has commanded us to enwrap ourselves with mitzvahs so that we remember to do all His mitzvahs, like we spoke about, that the objective of the talus is to remind us about all of the mitzvahs. As the verse says, you will look upon them, the tzitzis, and you will remember all the commandments of Hashem. This is in the 3rd paragraph of the Shema, in Vayomer. And then, while standing, you make the bracha le'isatef b'tzitzis, li'tatef b'tzitzit. You should then immediately cover your head with the talus so that the talus extends below the mouth, and then bring the corners of the talus up to your neck and wrap yourself in the manner of the Arabs. I'll demonstrate this in a moment. You should remain standing like that for the length of time it takes to walk 4 amos, and recite a particular verse which is in the Siddur. After this, you may remove the talus from your head. You should take care, however, not to drag the tzitzis along the floor, but this would constitute disrespect for the mitzvah. Therefore, you should lift them, the tzitzis, and you may tuck them into your belt. So meaning, often you'll see people walking around the shul and the strings are kind of dangling along the floor. So you don't want that because that's it's a disrespect towards the mitzvah. So let me explain what we just discussed over here, because it sounds quite interesting. We're talking about Arabs, and we're talking about holding it closed for a certain amount of time, like wrapping it over your eyes and then wrapping it this way. So what's going on over here? So at the core of this halacha is a debate and what the mitzvah of wrapping yourself in a talus is. What's the definition of wrapping yourself? Is it good enough to have the talus just cover your body, like typically as our clothes do, meaning majority of your body, meaning it's resting on your shoulders and just dropping behind you? Or more than that, over your head as well, a little bit? Or more than that, there's an opinion that says that since the bracha is to wrap yourself, it means wrapping yourself the way the Arabs wrap themselves, meaning to really wrap yourself so that you're completely wrapped up in the garment. Now, we want to make sure that we cover it according to all opinions. Now, the minimum amount of time that we want to be wrapped in the talus is the amount of time it takes to walk 4 amos, about 4 steps, which is probably about 2 seconds. And so therefore, what we do is, when we put on the talus, we first completely wrap ourselves like the Arabs do. That way we've covered our basis of the opinion that says that wrapping in a talus means literally being wrapped up in the talus. We hold it there for the amount of time it takes to take 4 steps, because that way we know we fulfilled the mitzvah according to that opinion. But you don't need to daven the whole davening like that. Therefore, after that, you kind of open it up and you let it go either over your head and back or just over your back. So that's really at the core of this halacha. It's the debate amongst the rabbis, what's considered being wrapped in a talus? What is the mitzvah? Just to wear the talus or to be wrapped in a talus? And we follow both opinions. And that's why as we put the talus on, we wrap ourselves in it. So we've covered that opinion, and afterwards we just wear it regularly. Okay. The bracha over the tzitzis is only recited during the day. So if, for example, you're on a business trip in Cape Town and it's winter, and sometimes it could get light pretty late. I mean, in other places of the world, a lot later, and you want to daven. So what the communities often do is they'll put on the talus, but you can't make a bracha yet because it's still dark. And the mitzvah of talus is to wear the talus when you can see it. So that's what he's going to discuss over here. So he says the bracha over the tzitzis is recited only during the daytime and not at night. It is preferable not to recite the bracha over the tzitzis until the light of day is sufficient to distinguish between blue and white. If you put on the small talus while it was still night, because remember the small talus sometimes goes under your shirt. So let's say you got up bright and early, so you can't make the bracha because the mitzvah doesn't yet apply. Or if you put it on before your hands were washed, and so you weren't able to make the bracha, then when you make the bracha on the large talus, meaning when you daven, have in mind that it covers the small talus too. If you don't wear a large talus, like in many Ashkenazi communities, only people that are married wear a large talus. So then when you put the small talus on during the day, if your hands have been washed, you make a different bracha. You can't say lihitateh, to wrap yourself, because the small talus is not large enough to wrap yourself. Rather, you just say, al mitzvah tzitzis, thank you Hashem for the mitzvah of tzitzis. If you put it on while still unable to recite the bracha, then once it becomes day, then you can take the tzitzis in your hands and make the bracha. If you wore the tzitzis the whole night and you didn't sleep, so then you wouldn't be able to make a separate bracha. Even if you did sleep, if you wore it through the night, you haven't put it on, it's not a new day, so you should listen to somebody else's bracha. Okay, these are, I guess, still could be relevant if you're having an early start and you're wearing the small talus. But that was as far as the idea that the primary time for the mitzvah of tzitzis is during the day. Okay, now this one is actually very practical. You come to shul, you put on your talus, and then nature's calling, and you need to take a break. So how does that work? Can you walk out of shul in the middle of davening, and what do you do with the talus? Okay, you'll take it off. You're not going to take the talus with you into the bathroom. So when you put it back on, do you need to make another bracha? That's what he's going to speak about over here. And it's worth reminding ourselves of what we discussed in an earlier section, and that is that the Torah puts a strong emphasis on the prohibition of a person holding themselves back from when nature is calling. And therefore, even if a person is in shul in the middle of davening, if they feel a need, they should not wait. They should stop wherever they are and go and take care of their needs and come back and resume davening. And if that happens and you've removed your talus and you've put it back on, do you need to make another bracha? So let's see. So there's a few scenarios. There's one scenario where you take it off and you plan on putting it back on right away, and you put it back on right away. There's another scenario where you don't plan on putting it back on, but then you change your mind and you do. So you're like, I'm done over here, and you leave, and then you're like, okay, fine, actually, I'll come back. Maybe shul's all not that bad. So you decide to put your talus back on. Only 2 minutes have passed, but in the interim, you had thought you were done, and now you changed your mind. Or a third scenario, that you planned on putting it back on, but 4 hours down the line, it was Yom Kippur, and you came to shul bright and early at 8:30, and then you thought, okay, you've got to walk back home, and you'll come in a couple of hours' time. So in each of these scenarios, do you need to make another bracha when you put the talus back on? So the principle of this halacha is that the moment you take the talus off, the mitzvah is over. If you're going to put it back on, it's a new mitzvah, unless you planned on putting it back on. If you planned on putting it back on, then the first mitzvah never terminated, because it was just like you were taking a temporary break, in which case you would not need to make a second bracha. So So that's really the principle, that when you take the talus off and put it back on, you do need to make another bracha unless you had in mind to put it back on and not too long has passed. So let's see that inside. So if you take off your talus with the intention of putting it on again immediately, and even if you do so for the purpose of going to the lavatory, when you return and put it on again, you do not make another bracha, because as we said, you had in mind to put it back on. However, if your intention was not to put the talus on again immediately, and then you changed your mind and did put it on again, then you do make another bracha, because your first bracha expired. Session expired. If your talus fell off accidentally, so if it fell off completely, then it's like that mitzvah was lost, and now you're going to make a mitzvah. But if it didn't fall off completely, then you could kind of, as you feel it falling off, you're like, oh, there goes my talus. And then you're, okay, I'm going to put it back on. So by having that intention, then you're able to hold on to the bracha. So that's what he says over here. As long as part of the mitzvah remained upon you, you are not required to repeat the bracha. And then you just readjust the talus. However, if none of the talus remains on your body, although you're holding it by the string, since it's already not on your body, you would need to make another bracha. I see we are running out of time, and I was hoping to finish the section today. Maybe I'll run through the rest of the points quickly outside. So firstly, as far as borrowing a talus, what happens if you come into shul and you realize you forgot your talus at home? What do? So here's a very interesting halacha. If you see somebody else's talus and he's not around, and that's the only talus that's there, you can borrow it without asking him. Why? Because by default, Jews want mitzvahs to be done with their property. And if a guy has a talus in shul, he wants to chap as many mitzvahs with that talus as he can. So therefore, if you're not able to message him, it's Shabbos, or you don't have his number, you can take his talus without permission and put it on, because there is implied permission, because we assume, unless you know otherwise, that people want their talus to be used for a mitzvah. However, you can't walk away with it, meaning you have to wear it exactly where you find it and put it back, because that's already not part of the mitzvah, and people do not want you walking away with their talus. And number two, you got to fold it when you're done. Unless it's Shabbos. If it's Shabbos, there are some that are of the opinion that you cannot fold the talus on Shabbos. Even if you do, it should be folded in a less regular way, because it's an act of laundering one's garments. So on Shabbos, you would not have to fold it up again, because that's not what even the owner himself would do. Okay, now as far as materials, he says ideally it should be made of wool. And I guess we will have to finish up this section, please God, on Monday, since we've run out of time. And we'll probably take about another 2 minutes to finish it, and then we'll move on to the next section. Thanks for joining us, and wishing you a wonderful Yom Tov. And hope you could join us this evening for some